The scent of linseed oil and aged mahogany clung to me like a second skin, a comforting aroma that had been the backdrop to my life for as long as I could remember. My hands, calloused and precise, ran over the smooth grain of my favorite honing stone, a final, almost ritualistic gesture before I packed it away. Each tool in my kit had its designated slot, a custom-fitted home within the velvet-lined oak chest. Chisels, gouges, planes, all polished to a mirror sheen, razor-sharp edges protected by leather sheaths. Order was my religion, a bulwark against the inherent chaos of decay, the very force I dedicated my life to combating. This move, though. This inheritance. It felt less like a new project and more like an exile. My small, impeccably ordered city apartment, a sanctuary of quiet restoration, was now behind me. Ahead lay the unknown, a sprawling, derelict manor house in a corner of the country so remote it barely registered on modern maps. My great-uncle's estate, they called it. I hadn't even known I had a great-uncle. The solicitor's letter had been terse, formal, hinting at a property of considerable, if crumbling, magnitude, and a history best left unspoken. The drive had been a test of endurance, the last hour a descent into a tunnel of ancient oaks whose branches laced overhead, blotting out the sky. The road, once paved, had surrendered to encroaching moss and stubborn weeds, forcing my old utility vehicle to crawl. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old rust, or maybe just the promise of rain. It pressed in, a palpable presence, as if the very landscape resented my intrusion. Then, through a sudden break in the gnarled canopy, it appeared. Not a house, but a hulking silhouette against the bruised afternoon sky. A monstrous thing of pitted gray stone, its gables sharp as broken teeth, its windows dark, vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of ivy. It sat on a low rise, surveying its domain, or perhaps simply brooding. The gate, a wrought iron affair twisted into grotesque, forgotten shapes, hung half open on a single corroded hinge, groaning softly in the faint breeze. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, immediate, a physical thing that pressed against my eardrums. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic, just the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the overgrown drive and the low, mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves of the house. A shiver, not entirely from the chill, traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just an old building, it was a sleeping leviathan. The air was cool, carrying a distinct aroma of decay, wet plaster, dry rot, and something else, something vaguely acrid, like burnt sugar. I walked the length of the overgrown drive, the house looming larger with every step, its sheer scale becoming more daunting. The front door, a heavy slab of black oak studded with iron, or a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a snarling gargoyle. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy panes of a vast stained glass window depicting a scene I couldn't quite decipher, too much grime, too many shattered pieces. Mildew, old paper, and that strange, acrid note again, stronger now. My breath plumed faintly in the gloom. I moved through the ground floor, each step kicking up clouds of fine gray dust. Grand rooms, once opulent, now stood stripped bare or choked with shrouded furniture, like an assembly of ghosts. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creak of floorboards under my weight and the occasional, inexplicable whisper of the house settling. I found it in the north wing, tucked away behind a pantry and a disused scullery. A heavy, unmarked door, thicker than the others, with a robust iron lock that looked almost contemporary compared to the antique hardware elsewhere. My great-uncle, the solicitor had mentioned, had been a recluse, a tinkerer. This must have been his domain. The key I'd been given, the one labeled workshop, was surprisingly intricate. It slid into the lock with a soft click, and the heavy door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing not just a room, but a cavernous space. This was the workshop with power tools and guards. My eyes widened. The room was vast, easily twice the size of any other I'd seen so far. Overhead, exposed beams stretched across the ceiling, supporting a network of pulleys and chain hoists. Workbenches, thick with grime and scattered with rusted implements, lined the walls. But it wasn't just the sheer scale or the tools that caught my attention. It was the guards. Heavy-gauge wire mesh, almost like industrial fencing, enclosed several sections of the room, creating distinct, caged-off areas. One section housed what looked like an antiquated, but still formidable, lathe, its steel components gleaming faintly under a thick layer of dust. Another held a massive, cast-iron forge, its bellows cracked but intact. Even stranger were the reinforced metal doors set into the back wall, each secured with multiple deadbolts and thick, riveted plates. This wasn't just a hobbyist's workshop, it was a secure facility, designed to contain, to protect, or perhaps, to imprison. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, seemed to vibrate from the very air in here, a low thrum that settled deep in my chest. The acrid smell was strongest here, overlaid with the sharp tang of ozone and old machine oil. I walked deeper, my boots crunching on metal shavings and dried sawdust. The power tools themselves were impressive, a bandsaw with a blade as tall as me, a drill press that looked like it could bore through a bank vault, grinders, sanders, all of them industrial grade, far beyond anything a typical craftsman would own. They were encased in these heavy-duty frames, making them look like silent, waiting sentinels. It looked impossibly old, out of place among the heavy machinery. A prickle of unease, sharper than anything I'd felt so far, tightened the muscles in my neck. This place, this entire house, was a puzzle. But this room felt like the lock. The meticulous order I usually brought to my work, the careful logic of restoration, felt suddenly inadequate. My great-uncle, whoever he was, had built something more than a workshop here. He'd built a secret, and the air around it hummed with a tension that felt almost alive. The air in the cavernous space hung thick with the scent of aged metal and generations of settled dust, a strangely potent perfume that spoke of dormancy. Another section of the heavy-gauge wire mesh, like the others, enclosed a formidable, rusting press, its gears thick with dried grease and time. This was it, then, the workshop with power tools and guards. My breath plumed faintly in the chilly stillness. The sheer scale of the machinery, even in its inert state, was impressive, almost menacing. I ran a hand over a cold steel surface, feeling the fine grit of history under my palm. This wasn't just a workspace, it felt like a cage, or perhaps a tomb for forgotten industry. My initial determination, the drive that had pulled me into this decaying manor, solidified. This room, with its silent, hulking occupants, would be my first conquest. A methodical restoration, I decided, would start with the workbench tucked against the far wall. It was cluttered with an array of smaller, hand-forged tools, each a potential treasure beneath its grime. I retrieved my toolkit from the crate I'd hauled in, laying out my brushes, solvents, and precision screwdrivers with a familiar, almost ritualistic care. I began with a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface obscured by layers of varnish and dirt. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance of restoration, moved with practiced ease. The rhythmic scrape of a fine-grit sandpaper against the aged wood, the soft hiss as I applied a cleaning solution, these sounds were my anchors in the vast, quiet house. Hours melted away. I reached for a specific, narrow-bladed chisel I just used, intending to set it back in its designated slot in my roll. My hand met empty air. I frowned, certain I'd placed it right beside the box. I scanned the workbench, then the floor. Nothing. A prickle of annoyance, not alarm, stirred within me. I was meticulous, almost pathologically so, about my tools. I'd never mislaid one in the middle of a job. After a moment, I found it, lying across the open lid of the wooden box, a place I definitely hadn't put it. My brow furrowed. Had I done it unconsciously? Unlikely. I shook my head, dismissing it as a momentary lapse, a trick of a tired mind. The manor was quiet, unsettlingly so, and perhaps the solitude was already playing games. I resumed my work, the incident fading to a minor eccentricity. The light began to dim, painting the room in shades of gray. A faint, metallic clang echoed from the far end of the workshop, near the massive press. It wasn't loud, more like something heavy shifting, settling. I froze, my hand hovering over the wooden box. The sound seemed to resonate, not just in the air, but through the very stone beneath my feet. I waited, listening, my breath held. No reply. I walked slowly towards the source of the sound, my boots crunching softly on scattered debris. Nothing seemed out of place. The heavy gears were still, the thick chains motionless. It felt as though something had just been there, a presence that had retreated only moments before my approach. Back at the workbench, I tried to immerse myself again, but the rhythm was broken. My focus kept snagging on the periphery of my vision. I pulled my jacket tighter. It was faint, indistinct, a breathy murmur that seemed to coil from the very fabric of the room. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a sound that suggested speech, a dry rustling like old leaves or brittle paper. I snapped my head up, my gaze sweeping the vast space, my heart giving a sudden, violent thrum against my ribs. My rational mind, the meticulous part of me that relied on logic and tangible evidence, fought to categorize these experiences. Old house settling. Drafts. Tiredness. Imagination. The feeling of being watched intensified, a persistent pressure on the back of my neck. It wasn't paranoia, it was a certainty. I wasn't alone in this massive, silent house. The air in the cavernous space still hung thick, a strange, potent perfume of aged metal and generations of settled dust. I'd spent the last few days wrestling with that monstrous press, its gears thick with dried grease, but the sheer scale of the manor meant I couldn't dwell on one project for too long. My current focus had shifted to a collection of ornate wooden wall panels, salvaged from what used to be the main drawing room, a place of crumbling plaster and sagging floorboards. They were stacked carefully in the workshop with power tools and guards, awaiting my attention. My fingers, calloused but nimble, traced the intricate carvings on the first panel. Oak, I thought, or perhaps a very dark walnut, stained almost black by time and neglect. The surface was a tapestry of grime, but beneath it, I could sense the latent beauty. The hum of the industrial dust extractor, a low, steady thrum, filled the space, a mechanical counterpoint to the creaks and groans of the old house settling around me. I began with a soft brush, dusting away the loose particulate matter, then moved to a more robust cleaner, working in small, deliberate sections. It was a meditative process, one I knew intimately. The slow revelation of grain, the deepening of color, the subtle details emerging from obscurity, that was the reward. As I worked on the fourth panel, a particularly large one with a central motif of intertwined thorny vines, my thumb snagged on something. Not a splinter, but a faint, almost imperceptible ridge. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the ancient wood. The panel was roughly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, a single, solid piece. Or so I thought. I ran my fingertips over the ridge again, following its path. It wasn't a natural grain line, nor was it a flaw in the carving. It was too straight, too deliberate. It ran vertically down the center of the panel, then turned sharply at the bottom, disappearing beneath the accumulated layers of dirt and old varnish. My restorer's instinct, honed over decades, screamed at me. This wasn't just a panel. This was a cover. I retrieved a specialized microchisel and a magnifying loupe from my toolkit. The weight of the tools in my hand felt familiar, reassuring. With slow, painstaking care, I began to clear the grime along the faint line. The dust extractor droned on, oblivious. Beneath the layers of black, I could just make out a hairline seam, almost perfectly flush, but definitely there. The wood on either side of the seam was a fraction of a shade different, a detail only visible under intense scrutiny. It spoke of a craftsmanship designed to be invisible. My heart picked up a beat, a quiet flutter in my chest. This was the kind of secret I lived for, the hidden ingenuity of bygone eras. I worked my way around the entire perimeter of the seam, revealing a rectangular outline. There was no visible handle, no keyhole. This was a push latch mechanism, or something even more cleverly disguised. I pressed gently along the edges, feeling for any give. Nothing. I tried a firmer push near where I estimated a latch might be, about halfway down the vertical line. Still nothing. Frustration, a rare visitor in my methodical world, began to prickle. I stepped back, wiping my hands on my canvas apron, and took a breath. My gaze swept over the entire panel, searching for a clue. Then I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible pinhole, no wider than a needle, nestled within the eye of one of the carved thorn blossoms near the top left corner. It was perfectly integrated into the design, a masterstroke of concealment. I fetched a slender steel probe, fine as a sewing needle, from my precision tools. With a deep breath, I inserted the probe into the pinhole. It slid in easily, meeting no resistance. I pushed further, feeling a soft click. A faint shudder ran through the panel, almost imperceptible. I put my hands on the seam and pushed. This time, with a soft, dry groan of ancient wood, a section of the panel, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, swung inward, revealing a cavity. The space beyond was small, barely a foot deep, and utterly black. No light had touched it in decades, perhaps centuries. The air that wafted out was different from the workshop's familiar must. It was still, cold, and carried a faint, sweet, cloying odor, like dried flowers mixed with something metallic. I grabbed a powerful LED flashlight. Inside, resting on a velvet-lined shelf that had long since decayed into brittle dust, was a single, leather-bound journal. The leather was dry and cracked, the pages within swollen with humidity. I pulled it out carefully, my fingers trembling slightly. The journal felt heavier than its size suggested. As I held it, a sudden, jarring sensation hit me. I stood there, flashlight beam playing over the journal's cover, and for a solid 10 seconds, I couldn't remember what I was doing, or where I was. The workshop, the tools, the manor itself, it all blurred into a vague, formless impression. The journal. The hidden compartment. The panel. The workshop. I blinked, shaking my head. A dizzy spell? Dehydration? I hadn't eaten properly all day. Or maybe it was just the sheer exhaustion of this place, the constant demands of restoration, the isolation. Yes, that had to be it. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. My mind was playing tricks on me. But the moment had been so absolute, so complete. A blank. I pushed the thought away, forcing my attention back to the journal. My fingers traced the unsettling knot on its cover. The leather felt strangely warm beneath my fingertips, as if it had been recently handled. I opened the journal. The first page was brittle, almost crumbling, covered in a spidery, faded script. The ink was a deep, almost black hue, but age had rendered it indistinct in places. I leaned closer, trying to decipher the archaic handwriting. The words were mostly indecipherable, but fragments jumped out at me. The warding. Against the erosion. To forget. Forget? The words seemed to echo the strange blankness I'd just experienced. Coincidence. Pure, unsettling coincidence. It had to be. My mind, I told myself, was simply overtired, trying to make sense of the strange and the old. But as I turned the fragile page, a creeping unease, far deeper than simple fatigue, settled in my gut. And it was just beginning to reveal itself. But as I turned, the fleeting glimpse of something, a shadow, a flicker of movement where there should have been only the wall, vanished. My breath caught, a sharp, involuntary intake. I stood there, utterly still, listening to the creak of the old house settling around me. Nothing. Only the familiar groans of ancient timber and the distant murmur of the wind. Coincidence, I'd told myself. Overtired, but the words, erosion? Forget, still scraped at the edges of my thoughts, an unwelcome whisper. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and frantic research. That strange blankness, the feeling of a word just out of reach, it had lodged itself deep. I couldn't shake it. My meticulous nature, usually a source of calm, now drove me to dig, to uncover. I spent hours hunched over my laptop in the Manor's dim library, surrounded by shelves of untouched, dust-laden tomes, searching for anything about the Manor's history, its previous occupants, or even just the local area. The internet proved a frustrating labyrinth of dead ends and vague mentions. Most of the Manor's history was either lost or deliberately buried. I found fragmented accounts in digitized local newspapers from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Another, from 1923, spoke of the disappearance of a young woman, a housemaid employed at the old Thorn place, last seen entering the property. There were reports of a gentleman of means who had taken possession in the 1930s, only to be found wandering the nearby woods, disoriented and unable to recall his own name. The articles were careful, almost evasive, using euphemisms like nervous affliction or disturbed faculties. But the implication was clear: people associated with this house often ended up lost, mad. Simply gone. It was a thread, thin and frayed, but undeniably there. Sleep offered no escape. My nights became a succession of vivid, disorienting nightmares. I dreamed of standing in a vast, empty room, the walls slowly dissolving into a gray mist. My own reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. I'd try to speak, to call out, but no sound would come. My name, Reed, would feel alien on my tongue, a word I was trying to recall rather than one I owned. One afternoon, I was meticulously sanding an antique desk in the workshop with power tools and guards, the rhythmic hum of the orbital sander a familiar, grounding sound. Sawdust motes danced in the shafts of light slicing through the high windows. I was focused, lost in the precise work of restoration, the kind of detailed labor that usually cleared my mind. I reached for the next grade of sandpaper, my hand moving without conscious thought, but then I paused. What was I doing? The desk was nearly finished, wasn't it? I looked down at the smooth, almost glowing surface. It was perfect. I had just completed the final buffing. But I remembered reaching for the sander, the start of the process. My fingers, still gritty with the fine dust, felt alien. How long had I been standing there, staring at the desk? Had I just finished it, or was I only now starting to work on it? The memory of the hours I'd spent on it, the specific techniques I'd applied, the small imperfections I'd corrected, it was all there, but it felt disconnected. Like reading a detailed report of someone else's work. I glanced around the workshop, at the benches piled with tools, the silent forms of the guards near the main entrance, their presence a solid, mundane fact. I shook my head, a desperate attempt to dislodge the fog. My hands, my own hands, had done this work. I knew they had. But the certainty, the clear, unbroken chain of memory, was faltering. It was like trying to grasp smoke. Was this what had happened to the gentleman of means? Was I slowly, irrevocably, losing myself to this house? The thought was a raw, exposed nerve. The research, instead of providing answers, had only laid bare the terrifying truth. The manor didn't just hold secrets, it consumed them, starting with the very minds of those who dared to seek them out. And I, Reed, was becoming its next meal. The hum of the industrial dust extractor was a familiar comfort in the vast, echoing space of the workshop with power tools and guards. At least, it used to be. I was hunched over a section of ornate wainscoting I'd salvaged from the manor's dining room, the grain of the dark oak still whispering tales of forgotten dinners and hushed conversations. Two of the guards stood near the entrance, their presence a dull, constant weight. They didn't speak, didn't move much, just observed. Their stillness was more unsettling than any overt action. I'd seen them around the manor too, mostly in the lower levels, always watchful. Who they were, or who they worked for, remained an unasked question. It was simpler, I told myself, not to ask. My focus drifted, as it had been doing more and more lately. I found myself staring at a knot in the oak, seeing not just the swirling pattern of growth, but faces, contorted and indistinct, just at the edge of recognition. My chisel slipped, scoring a deep line across the delicate carving I'd spent hours cleaning. A sharp intake of breath. Frustration, hot and immediate, flared. This wasn't like me. I prided myself on precision, on a meticulous hand. Careful, Reed, a voice murmured, close enough to prickle the hairs on my neck. I spun around, chisel still in hand, my heart giving a violent lurch. One of the guards had moved. He was closer than before, standing just behind my workbench, his face obscured by the shadow cast from the high windows. I hadn't heard him approach. Not a footstep. The guard didn't answer directly. He simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. The light shifted, and for a fleeting instant, his face seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. His features blurred, softened, then hardened again, but not quite into the same configuration. I could feel the edges fraying, the certainty I once held about myself slipping away like sand. The little things. The forgotten names. The misplaced tools. The way the past keeps changing shape, doesn't it? My gaze darted to the other guard, who remained by the entrance, unmoving, a silent sentinel. Had he heard this? Was this normal? I swallowed hard. You're trying to confuse me. Am I? The guard behind me stepped forward, into the pale light. His face was clearer now, but it wasn't the face I remembered seeing just moments ago. It was different. Younger? Older? You forget easily these days. He gestured vaguely around the workshop. Just like you forgot about this place. Forgot about this place? I'd been coming here for weeks, working on the Manor's relics. It was the only place I felt remotely safe, surrounded by my tools, my craft. But as I looked around, the familiar layout seemed subtly wrong. The drill press, usually positioned by the far wall, was closer, almost directly opposite my bench. I've been here. Or have you just been told you've been here? A memory that never happened. The phrase echoed the unsettling feeling I'd been battling, the growing suspicion that parts of my own past were no longer solid. Was this connected? Was this it? I gripped the workbench, my knuckles white. Get away from me. He ignored me, his gaze fixed on mine, penetrating and unnerving. Tell me, Reed. What was your mother's maiden name? The question hit me like a physical blow. My mother's maiden name. It was. I knew it. Of course, I knew it. It was a simple fact, fundamental. A vast, echoing chasm where a simple memory should have resided. I knew it. It was on her gravestone. It was on my birth certificate. Gone. My voice failed me. My throat was dry, constricted. The guard smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. See? Fraying at the edges. Not so meticulous now, are you? He reached out, his hand moving with agonizing slowness towards the wainscoting I'd been restoring. His fingers, long and thin, brushed the scored wood. Soon, you won't even remember what you're trying to fix. Or why. Suddenly, the other guard, the one by the entrance, shifted. He coughed, a loud, deliberate sound that broke the spell. The guard in front of me flinched, his head snapping towards his colleague. The moment was broken. The strange, shifting features on his face solidified, becoming once again the face I vaguely remembered. He looked at me, then back at the wainscoting, then at his colleague. The intensity in his eyes dimmed. Yes. Everything's fine. His voice was normal, even unremarkable. He stepped back, putting a few feet between us. Just observing your work, Reed. Carry on. He gave a curt nod, then turned and walked back to join the other guard by the entrance, resuming his silent, watchful stance. I stood there, trembling, the chisel still clutched in my hand. My mother's maiden name. It was still gone. My mind frantically scrabbled, desperate to retrieve the information, but it was just emptiness. I was losing myself, and I had no idea how to stop it. The air in the workshop with power tools and guards still hummed with the ghosts of electric motors, though everything was silent now. His colleague by the entrance cleared his throat again, a dry, rasping sound. "Everything all right, Reed?" the guard closest to me asked, his voice flat, devoid of the inflection I remembered from earlier conversations. I forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt like cracked porcelain on my face. "Just admiring the craftsmanship." My restorer's eye appreciated the order, even as my mind screamed a warning. "Indeed," the guard replied, his eyes unwavering. He didn't move, just stood there, a silent, imposing block of gray uniform. I needed to get out. My instincts, usually so reliable, were screaming at me. This wasn't right. Nothing about this manor, these men, felt right anymore. "I think I'll head back to my room," I announced, trying for a casual tone that felt alien in my own throat. "Long day. Need to clear my head." I took a step, then another, towards the wide double doors that led out into the main corridor. The guard didn't budge. He simply pivoted on the balls of his feet, maintaining his position directly in my path. His colleague by the entrance shifted, his hand resting lightly on the heavy iron bolt that secured one of the doors. It wasn't an aggressive move, not overtly threatening, but it was clear. A barrier. The owner prefers guests to remain contained during certain hours, Reed, the first guard said, his voice still flat. "For your own safety." "Contained?" I echoed, the word lodging in my throat like a shard of glass. "I'm not a prisoner." A cold prickle spread across my scalp. "I'm the owner. I inherited this place." The guard's expression didn't change. "The arrangements are temporary. Until everything is settled." My jaw tightened. Settled? What did that even mean? I looked from one guard to the other. Their faces were impassive, unreadable. There was no point arguing. Not here, not now. I needed to think. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, searching for my phone. It wasn't there. A jolt went through me. Had I left it in my room? Or had it been taken? I distinctly remembered having it earlier, checking a text from a colleague about a shipment of varnish, or had I? A flicker of doubt, brief but potent, gnawed at the edges of that memory. "I need to make a call," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "My business. Urgent matters." The guard merely gestured vaguely around the workshop. "There's an old landline on the wall, by the workbench." My eyes darted to the spot. Sure enough, an ancient, cream-colored rotary phone hung next to a pegboard cluttered with wrenches. It looked like a relic from another era, as if the manor itself had spit it out. I walked over, my movements stiff, feeling their eyes on my back. The phone was heavy, dusty. I picked up the receiver. No dial tone. Just a dead, hollow silence. I pressed the hook switch a few times, mashed my thumb against the rotary dial, twisting it back and forth. Nothing. Not a hum, not a click, not even the faint static of a disconnected line. My breath hitched. I put the receiver back, the plastic clacking against the base. This couldn't be right. Even if the line was dead, there should be some indication. My room. I visualized the antique desk, the stack of papers, the small leather-bound journal. Had I put it there? Or on the bedside table? The image wavered, growing blurry at the edges. A sudden wave of disorientation washed over me, a brief, unsettling blankness where the memory of my phone's location should have been. It was like a piece of the puzzle had been deliberately erased, leaving a smooth, featureless surface. I blinked, shaking my head slightly, trying to dislodge the fog. No phone, no way out, and these silent, watchful guards. The line's dead, I stated, turning back to them. My voice was tight now, stripped of its earlier pretense. And I can't find my mobile. The guard by the workbench nodded slowly, as if this was precisely what he expected. Communication is difficult in the Manor, read. The old walls, you see. Very thick. He paused, then added, interference. Interference. The word hung in the air, heavy and vague. It wasn't a technical explanation, it was an implication. A deliberate block. The entity. It was cutting me off, isolating me. I looked at the heavy doors again, then at the guards. They were unmoving, like statues carved from granite. The hum of the idle machinery around me seemed to grow louder, morphing into a low, menacing growl in my ears. I was trapped. The Manor wasn't just old, it was actively hostile. And it was winning. The sense of helplessness was a suffocating blanket, pressing down on me, threatening to extinguish the last flickering embers of my resolve. Interference. The word still resonated, a cold, calculated strike. It wasn't a technical glitch, my mind now screamed, it was a deliberate severing. The entity. It had cut me off, isolated me. The thought sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the chill in the workshop with power tools and guards. I looked at the heavy workbench before me, its scarred surface holding a half-disassembled grandfather clock. They were here, but they weren't here. They were just another layer of the strange, unbreachable wall that had slowly risen around me. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of sawdust, old oil, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that wasn't from the iron filings on the floor. It was a taste, not just a smell, clinging to the back of my throat. My fingers, still gritty from handling ancient wood, instinctively traced the faint, almost invisible symbols carved into the underside of the clock's base. I'd thought them decorative initially, an artisan's flourish. They weren't mere decoration. They were repeated patterns, subtle variations of a central design I'd seen before, etched into the Manor's oldest foundation stones, woven into the frayed tapestries of forgotten rooms. A memory, fragile as brittle parchment, fluttered at the edge of my consciousness. A book. A heavy, leather-bound volume I'd found in the Manor's dusty, disused library, its pages brittle, its script archaic. I hadn't understood it then, dismissed it as some local folklore, a superstitious relic. But those symbols. They were identical. The book had spoken of an ancient, pre-Christian belief, a hungry spirit that predated the land itself, an entity that feasted not on flesh, but on the very essence of being. The silent guards, the tools glinting under the sparse overhead lights, the muted hum of the unused drill press. It all felt wrong, like a stage set for a terrifying play I was unwillingly performing in. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was the house, or at least intimately intertwined with it, a parasitic root system beneath the foundations. It had lain dormant, perhaps, for centuries, waking only when disturbed, when someone, like me, began to stir the dust of its forgotten past, to restore its surroundings. The truth began to click into place with the sickening precision of a well-oiled lock. It was a deliberate, ongoing process. The entity was feeding. And it wasn't a quick, violent act. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, a meticulous dismantling, much like my own work, but in reverse. I was an antique restorer, painstakingly bringing history back to life. This thing was an identity devourer, meticulously reducing life to history. I remembered the previous owner, a solitary man whose diaries I'd found. His later entries were chaotic, disjointed, filled with repetitions and fears of losing himself. Now, I understood. He hadn't gone mad. He'd been consumed. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, not from any of the workshop's machinery, but from somewhere deeper, beneath the earth. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, yet it resonated within my bones. The entity wasn't just siphoning off my past, it was siphoning off my future. It wanted everything. The ultimate cost, then, wasn't just my life, but myself. And what did it demand to be appeased, or, impossibly, defeated? It wasn't a blood sacrifice, not in the traditional sense. My purpose, my craft, my very being was its target. To defeat it, I would have to find a way to starve it, to cut off its supply, without losing myself in the process. And the horrifying implication was that the only way to truly stop it might be to offer it something so profound, so absolute, that it would either satiate its hunger for good, or destroy it utterly. My hands clenched, splinters digging into my palms. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, almost acrid. The guards remained impassive, their eyes like chips of obsidian. I was alone, truly alone, with a terrifying, ancient truth. The entity wanted me. Not my body, but my mind, my memories, the very essence of Reed. And it was going to take it, piece by agonizing piece, unless I found a way to fight back. The question was, with what? And how much of myself would I have to give up in the attempt? The cold, calculated strike of interference still echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind. It wasn't a glitch, no, never a glitch. The entity. It had pruned me from the world, like a withered branch from a dying tree, leaving me to rot in its isolated garden. I stood amidst the gleaming steel and oiled wood, the silent sentinels of my craft. Around me, the familiar hum of idle machinery seemed to vibrate with a low, predatory purr. They weren't speaking, not to me, not to each other. Just watching. I was a specimen under glass, observed, contained. The sharpness felt real, a grounding sensation in a world that increasingly refused to cohere. Memories flickered, half-formed, like moths drawn to a distant flame, then vanishing into the encroaching fog. Had I eaten today? Yesterday? What was the name of the colleague who dropped off the antique desk last week? The face was there, a blurred impression, but the name? Gone. Each blank space was a victory for it, another inch of my essence devoured. But even as the tendrils of oblivion tightened, a stubborn, desperate spark ignited within me. It fed on memory, on identity. That was its hunger. But what if it could be sated? Or, more grimly, What if it could be overwhelmed? What if its feast could become its undoing? It was old, dense, full of forgotten life. My thumbs ran over its rough grain, a faint scent of dust and earth clinging to it. As I held it, a fragmented image flashed into my mind, a drawing, from one of the Manor's oldest ledgers. And within that chamber, a figure, not human, but undeniably contained. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. It wasn't about destruction. It wasn't about banishment. It was about containment. The entity didn't die. It simply was. And the only thing capable of truly holding it, of becoming its inescapable prison, was a living, breathing, willing mind. My mind. The guards shifted, a soft scrape of their boots on the concrete floor. Did they sense the shift in my resolve? Did they see the terrifying clarity in my eyes? I doubt it. This was the desperate plan. To offer myself. To become the Manor's final, living vault. To take the full brunt of its consumption, not as a victim, but as a trap. My identity, my memories, every last shred of what made me read, would become the walls of its eternal cell. It would consume everything, yes, but in doing so, it would consume its own prison. And I, or what was left of me, would become the lock. My gaze fell upon a carving chisel, its tip honed to a wicked point. The weight felt good in my hand. I moved towards the workbench, the hum of the power sander a low, inviting growl. This gnarled piece of oak. It would be my anchor, my focus. A physical representation of the labyrinthine prison I intended to construct within myself. I powered on the sander, the wine filling the workshop, momentarily drowning out the silent vigil of the guards. A cloud of fine sawdust plumed into the air, catching the stark overhead lights. My hands, surprisingly steady, began to work the wood. I wasn't restoring it. I was shaping it. Carving it. Not into a beautiful antique, but into something stark, angular, with deep, recessed channels. A miniature maze, perhaps. A symbol. The guards didn't stir. They simply observed. My fingers ached, but the pain was a welcome distraction from the gnawing emptiness inside my head. Each stroke of the chisel, each pass of the sander, was an act of defiance, a step closer to the precipice. I would not simply fade. I would become the weapon. I would become the cage. The scent of burning wood filled my nostrils, sharp and clean, cutting through the faint mustiness of the workshop. I worked with an intensity one hadn't felt in weeks, perhaps months. Time had become a meaningless concept. All that mattered was the oak, and the labyrinth taking shape beneath my hands. This was the event, the preparation for the ultimate sacrifice. My mind was a crumbling edifice, but the foundation of my resolve remained. It was tragic, yes, to willingly offer up what little remained of myself. To know that the man named Reed would cease to exist, replaced by a silent, conscious tomb. But it was also heroic, in its own grim way. This was not surrender. This was a final, desperate act of will. A final, horrifying purpose. The entity wanted my identity? It would have it all. And it would choke on it. It wasn't a glitch, no, never a glitch. It was a deliberate severing. The entity. The thought tried to splinter, to dissolve into the hazy static that now coated the edges of my perception, but I clung to it. Pruned. That word, precise and sharp, was a seat of resistance. If I'd been pruned, I could still regrow. I could still fight. My plan, a desperate gamble forged in the flickering moments of clarity, was my only hope. It led me, or what was left of me, to the workshop with power tools and guards. The air here was a familiar symphony of industry, the acrid tang of cut metal, the sweet, resinous dust of freshly sawn timber, the faint, oily scent of machinery. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unwavering glare that made every shadow stark, every surface gleam with metallic indifference. 2 guards, silent and impassive, stood near the entrance, their presence a dull weight in the periphery of my awareness. They watched, but their eyes held no recognition, no concern. They were merely fixtures, part of the stage for my final stand. The heavy thrum of a band saw stood ready, its serrated blade promising swift cuts. A sander whined softly in a corner, waiting. These were my tools, the extensions of my craft, the very essence of Reed the Restorer. This was where I would anchor myself. This was it. I would carve a representation of my hands, the tools that define my life, the instruments of my identity. A physical anchor, something undeniable, something I could create, something that defied the entity's slow decay. As I clamped the oak into a vise, a tremor ran through my arm. The workshop lights flickered, not in sequence, but erratically, like dying embers. The hum of the machinery distorted, stretching into a guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My vision blurred, the clean lines of the tools on the bench wavering, softening, then hardening into grotesque parodies. A name. A sound. A fleeting thought. I ignored it, forcing my trembling hand to select a small, sharp chisel. The cool steel against my palm was a small comfort, a shard of reality. I pressed the tip against the oak, ready to make the first cut. Then it began in earnest. Memories, once vibrant and solid, dissolved into kaleidoscopic fragments. I saw my father, his kind eyes crinkling as he showed me how to hold a brush, but his face began to melt, features running like wax. My earliest restoration projects, the joy of bringing life back to forgotten objects, became scenes of wanton destruction, my hands smashing priceless artifacts. You are a destroyer, Reed, the whisper intensified, now a chorus of voices, some familiar, some alien. You pretend to build, but you only break. You tear down. You consume. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. Sweat beaded on my forehead, stinging as it ran into my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear the haze, to focus on the oak. The guards, I noticed, were still there, unmoving, their faces blank. Were they real? Or were they just part of this elaborate, suffocating illusion? No, I muttered, my voice hoarse. I create. I restore. I gripped the chisel, my knuckles white. This was the event. This act of creation was my defiance. I brought the mallet down, a sharp, clean thwack against the chisel's handle. A sliver of oak flew, the scent of fresh wood filling my nostrils. The physical sensation, the solid impact, was a jolt of truth. I focused on it, on the grain, on the precise angle of the cut. The entity raged against this. It wasn't just trying to erase my memories, it was twisting the very meaning of them. It wanted me to believe I was never Reed, that my entire life was a lie, a delusion. It didn't just consume, it redefined. This was the reveal. Its power lay in its ability to dismantle my identity from the inside out, making me doubt my own sanity, making me the architect of my own undoing. But the chisel in my hand, the wood beneath it, was undeniable. I was creating. I was here. I continued, stroke after stroke, carving the rough outline of a hand, a strong, capable hand, one that knew the weight of tools and the texture of ancient wood. Each chip of wood that fell to the floor was a small victory, a piece of myself I was reclaiming. My body felt heavy, my limbs like lead, but my hands, those precious, skilled hands, kept working. They remembered. They knew. They were read. But I fought back with the only weapon I had, the deliberate, painstaking act of creation. The wood, the chisel, the rhythmic tap of the mallet, they were my anchors, my tether to a self I refused to relinquish. The guards remained unmoving, silent witnesses to a war no one else could perceive. I wouldn't let it consume me. Not here. Not now. I was Reed, and I would carve my existence into this world, one deliberate stroke at a time. The sculpture of my hand, though still crude, began to take shape, a testament to my defiant will. My breath hitched, my vision swam, but the chisel did not falter. The battle for self was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a fragile, burning hope. I was still here. I was still me. My head still throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. I blinked, trying to clear the haze, to focus on the oak, on anything. The air in the workshop with power tools and guards hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something else, something fetid and sharp, like old blood and dust. The guards. I looked for them. They were gone. The space where they'd stood, rigid and unblinking, was empty. A faint impression remained on the concrete floor, a shadow that wasn't a shadow, a distortion in the air that my eyes kept trying to resolve into form. I remembered. What did I remember? A struggle. A desperate, clawing fight not against them, but against something through them. A tearing sensation, like ripping wet canvas. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, uncooperative. My antique restorer's hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled. I stared at them, at the faint lines of grime ingrained in the calluses, the way the light from the bare bulb above glinted off a stray splinter of wood caught under a nail. Were these my hands? A strange, detached curiosity flickered through me. Of course they were. Whose else would they be? But the question lingered, a faint, unsettling echo. The workshop itself seemed different. The rows of chisels, saws, and sanding machines, usually so orderly, were undisturbed. But a fine layer of dust, almost like ash, coated every surface. It clung to the workbench, draped the power saw, and softened the sharp edges of the drill press. I took a shaky step, then another, moving towards the heavy oak door I had somehow managed to get open, or had it been opened for me? The memory felt slippery, like trying to grasp smoke. My bare feet scuffed against the gritty floor. A faint, cloying sweetness, like decay mixed with something vaguely floral, pricked at my nostrils. It was the Manor's signature scent, intensified, made sickening. I touched the oak doorframe, the wood cool and solid under my fingertips. A deep gouge, ragged and fresh, ran down the side. My doing, or the entity's? It was a blur, A chaotic collage of flashing images and fragmented sensations. A roar, not from my throat, but through it. A surge of desperate will, a final, defiant push against the erosion, and then the tearing. I reached the doorway, stepping out into the hushed, cavernous hallway. Lighter. Not gone, but diminished, like a predator sated, sleeping. Or perhaps, merely wounded. I leaned against the cold stone wall, my breath catching in my throat. I had won. I was sure of it. The entity, whatever it was, had recoiled. I had pushed it back, severed its hold, at least for now, but the cost. I closed my eyes, trying to summon a specific memory, a touchstone. My childhood home. The smell of my mother's baking. The feel of my father's hand on my shoulder. Nothing. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where those memories should have been. My first antique restoration, the thrill of bringing something ancient back to life. My mentor's booming laugh. The face of a friend? A colleague? A lover? It wasn't just fragmented, it was gone. Entire swaths of my past, the very fabric of who I was, had been meticulously, brutally excised. I could recall the concept of a mother, a father, a mentor, but the emotional resonance, the specific sensory details, the faces, the names. They were simply not there. Like pages ripped from a book, leaving only blank spaces and ragged edges. I ran a hand over my face, over the stubble on my chin, the sharp line of my jaw. My reflection, when I caught it in a dusty, cracked mirror further down the hall, was a stranger's. My eyes, deep-set and haunted, stared back with a bewildered intensity. My own face, yet alien. The weariness etched around my mouth, the lines on my forehead, they spoke of a life I could no longer fully access. This wasn't victory. This was an exchange. I had pushed the entity back, but it had taken its pound of flesh, and then some. I was Reed, I knew my name, but the story behind it, the intricate tapestry of experiences that made me me, had been unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. The scars were permanent. And they were just beginning to ache. The air in the workshop with power tools and guards hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang, a coppery taste coating my tongue. I coughed, a dry rasp that grated in my throat, and pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. The floor, splintered and grimy, felt impossibly far below. I remember a wrench, the heavy thud as it connected with something more than wood, something that shrieked without sound, a vibration that rattled my bones. I remember the sudden, desperate lurch, like a void opening beneath me, and then quiet. A profound, echoing quiet that swallowed the usual hum of the nearby machinery. I stumbled out of the workshop with power tools and guards, past the silent, hulking forms of the guards, their faces impassive. The exit door, a heavy steel slab, seemed to beckon, promising an outside that felt impossibly distant. I pushed it open, the screech of protesting hinges a brutal assault on my ears, and stepped into the pale, indifferent light of dawn. I left the manor that day. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the property, the inheritance, the years of work I'd poured into it. I just wanted to be free. Months passed. I moved to a different city, one with bustling streets and the constant murmur of human voices, a cacophony I now found strangely comforting. I got a small apartment, started a new life, found work at a different antique restoration studio. The wood there smelled of lemon polish and aged veneer, not damp earth and decay. The other restorers were genial, their hands calloused but their eyes clear. I tried to rebuild, to forget. Sometimes, a sudden draft would make the hairs on my neck prickle. A particular pattern in an old tapestry would seem to shift, just at the edge of my vision. A familiar scent, old paper, something faintly sweet and cloying, would momentarily ghost past me, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. I dismissed them as phantom sensations, the lingering echoes of a traumatic experience. My mind playing tricks. It had to be. I found myself drawn to certain pieces, though. Not the elegant furniture or the delicate porcelain, but the worn, the forgotten, the pieces that had passed through countless hands, carrying untold stories. A chipped wooden box, a tarnished silver locket, a faded leather-bound diary with no discernible author. I'd spend hours tracing their contours, feeling the subtle indentations left by time and touch. My colleagues would comment on my unusual focus, my quiet intensity. "You really connect with the history, Reed," one of them, a meticulous carver, observed once, his brow furrowed in admiration. I'd just nod, a tight smile on my face. One evening, alone in my apartment, I was examining a small, unadorned wooden frame. It was ancient, its surface smooth as river stone from centuries of handling. My fingers traced the inner edge, feeling the faint, almost imperceptible grooves. As I did, a thought, clear and sharp, bloomed in my mind: it needs a memory. The thought startled me. It wasn't my usual way of thinking. I wasn't an artist, I was a restorer. My job was to preserve, not to create. Yet, the urge was insistent. I found a faded photograph I'd kept from my childhood, a snapshot of me, young and beaming, holding a kite. I carefully trimmed it, slid it into the frame. It fit perfectly. I sat staring at it, a strange sense of satisfaction settling over me. But then, a subtle shift occurred. The edges of the photo seemed to soften, the colors to deepen. And the memory itself. It wasn't just my memory anymore. I felt a different set of hands holding the kite string, smaller, more delicate. A different joy, sharper, tinged with a faint, unidentifiable sorrow. My breath hitched. I snatched the frame away, tossing it onto my desk as if it were burning me. My victory in the workshop with power tools and guards, that desperate, bone-jarring blow, hadn't destroyed the entity. It had merely changed its vessel. Or perhaps, it had simply found a new home. In me. The manor hadn't been a place it inhabited, it had been a method it used to draw in its sustenance. And I, in my frantic attempt to defeat it, had absorbed it, becoming its new conduit. I looked around my apartment, at the few personal items I had scattered about, the photographs, the trinkets, the small, unassuming objects that held fragments of my past. They no longer felt like anchors to my identity. They felt like bait. The metallic tang, I realized, hadn't been from the tools. It had been the taste of an ancient hunger. It was a new kind of consciousness, ancient and vast, stirring within me. I walked over to the desk, my movements deliberate, almost graceful. My fingers, no longer just my own, reached for the wooden frame. I picked it up, feeling the faint tremor of something immense and hungry now inextricably linked to my very being. The photograph, the memory within it, pulsed with a dim, borrowed light. I was the collector now. And the world was full of forgotten stories, of cherished moments, all waiting to be absorbed, assimilated, made new. Made mine.